Welcome back to another exciting adventure through the world of theology. I think everything is working. I think we're doing fine. I think there are bears behind me. I don't know if anyone's here watching, but here we go, seeing, bears, exactly. As far as I know, and I could be wrong, this is actually a live cam of actual bears doing actual salmon hunting. And we watched a bear documentary not too long ago. I forget what it was called, probably something like Bears. It was one of those Disney documentaries. And it journeyed through a mama bear and her baby cubs and the ups and downs. And the nice thing about the nature documentaries, the newer ones of Disney, is they don't kill all the animals. So they all survived. I hope I didn't give it away. But it was fraught with danger and activity, and we got to see the drama that happens here. I make my video bigger. Whoa! Hello! Here I am. Is this big? How are we doing there? A bit bigger. Was that more than a bit bigger? Nice. Okay, there we go. All these things to pay attention to, and I assume since there's no complaints, you can hear me fine, that you can see all the various things that are happening. Hold on. There I am, back. It's my magic trick. Woo! Hey! There we go. Okay. They're not paying me a lot, so my tricks aren't that great. And in case you're wondering, I am wearing a jersey for the USA Quidditch team. So I'm blurry. Why am I blurry? I'm blurry? Oh, never mind. Okay. I knew the background's a little bit blurry. It's supposed to be in high definition, but I think the camera, being as it is in the middle of what I think is the Alaskan wilderness, doesn't have quite the streaming. Okay. Oh, right. So I freaked it out. Stay here, no tricks. Cameras do not like tricks. Oh, it was autofocus. Was that what it was? It needed to autofocus. Probably that's what was going on. So here we are back again. I had some very nice compliments off screen this last week, saying there are people watching who aren't involved in the chat, so that was encouraging. That's always nice to hear someone say that they were watching and were getting a lot out of it. Of course, that puts a lot of pressure now on to continue the structure. So if I just get the shakes and get too nervous, you'll realize I've just gotten overwhelmed. But here we are. And here we are with no big technical problems at first, from what I can tell. And from what I can tell, everything is fine. We got bears. Looks like we got some seagulls. We got some salmon, and the salmon are just wanting to get, to where they want to go, and the bears are trying to eat them, and there they are trying to jump up the stream, and the stream's going the other way, and if that's not an example about life, I don't know what is. Who's had this kind of week? Who feels very bearish this week? Who feels kind of salmonish this week? I think I've had more of a salmon summer than a bear summer. There have been times I've had more of a seagull summer, like I'm just sort of off on the margins and trying to get whatever's the leftovers, but yeah, definitely a salmon. Trying to jump up the stream, don't get eaten, that's what you can hope for, right? There's this little cycle of life and all those things. So there in the background, we will occasionally have bits of gore, of course, as the bears catch the salmon. And which happens a lot. If you watch, they make it seem like the bears aren't catching a lot of salmon, but if you watch this live thing, they're actually very good at it. Yes, hooray for fall. We have high hopes for fall. Definite hopes? Yeah, we'll see. Well, there's always things in going on that we're hopeful about, that we think are going to kick things into place, but it's always nice to hope for the next season. Cooler weather should be hitting us here in Northern California. This week it was 90 today. It's supposed to be in the 70s the rest of the week. And if I'm right, I even saw an upper 60s. which is us diving directly into fall very fast, and I don't trust it yet. This is where fall tempts you, saying, I'm here, get out all your cool clothes, dress up nice, but then it gets hot again, right when you're just ready, and then you're not used to it, so we'll see how it goes. All right, here we are with the bears, the seagulls, the hopeful salmon. Some are more hopeful than others. Some are just trying to make their way. Some just get eaten. So I don't offer this as a object lesson, but take from it what you will. I don't know why I choose the background videos. It's mostly here's something different. I'm trying not to repeat things so early in my process. I'm trying to really find the zone for the streaming background, and I like the idea of having some kind of nature videos or something going on in the background. Takes away from just staring at me. I used to watch, I was looking into what online theology teaching was like a little while ago, and I was struck by the idea that most of it is there's one problem. White guy sitting in an office with a tie, maybe a loose collar, but always a sport coat, with a bookshelf in the background, and him lecturing, which is basically, can we take a theology professor, put him on camera, but make no other changes other than that, which is, I know the appeal. Everyone's saying what we really want is to see someone who's in their office lecturing, and that's, the dream. And I'm trying to, try something different a little bit here. White guy sitting in my home office, but you can't tell because it looks like I'm sitting just at the river, right? And maybe there's going to be a bear behind me. We don't know that very rarely happens in most theology professors' office, where a bear starts coming in behind them. Maybe that would help theology be a little bit more practical. I don't know. Maybe we need more bears. Just that threat of, some large animal, coming in and mauling you really, really puts a razor's edge on one's theology. When you have tenure and your life is secure and you have a nice home and a nice car and you can't get fired. I have a decent car, I have a decent home. We're renting though, but you're put in a place of theology where all of life is very secure, and you talk about theology in a different way than you might if you're sitting in a river surrounded by bears who are hopefully eating salmon but may see a person. I don't think this live stream is going to the river. Maybe not. Maybe wouldn't that be interesting if live streams threw back what the videos were, and the bears started watching you, or maybe a bear is intuitive and knows we're watching. I don't know what goes on in bears' lives. Rarely. Yeah. Here we are. We're going to jump in a little bit more into theology. We talked a little bit about what theology is. If I were to have a quiz, I would say, what is theology? And I'd have you give answers. What is theology? It basically means words about God. It's one of those words that has a distinct, precise meaning, but means all sorts of whatever things. Can you do this? I'm losing my elbow if I go that side. I have to constrain my arm motions within this certain box. Whoa! I've lost my hand. Whoa! There you go. Okay, I'm just enjoying the process of learning how this works. Where was I? Theology is words about God, but it can mean big, like just this understanding of the universe in all its bigness. Sort of we think of supernatural, or it can mean a very precise theology, the specific doctrines of a certain religion. So we're talking about theology mostly in its Christian sense. Of course, it's overlapping. We're talking about it in its Christian sense because that's what I know, that's what I believe. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. This is what I'm arguing is the best picture of reality, and I'm not saying that too arrogantly. We all believe something, and that's what we're going to talk about today, this evening, here with the bears. And see how attentive the bears are. They're getting some water. They're having some dinner. Hopefully you've had some dinner. Get a glass of water. And we're going to talk about what it means to say, I believe. We're going to go through the Apostles' Creed and start slowly. We're not in a hurry here. We're just going to say, what does it mean to believe? How does that start? So we're going to hopefully... there we go. Here we go. I have a lot of words on the screen. Hopefully this isn't too blurry. If it is, that's the... I could have a bare screen. Bare screen. I was going to say a blank screen in the background, but now I have a bare screen. It gets tricky. If I had an aquarium, I won't get confused words. I could have a blank screen where you can see the words clearly, or I could have a bare screen where the words are less clear, but it's more fun in the background because the bears might do something. So, which again rarely happens in a church setting when you're reciting the Apostles' Creed, that bears are in front of you and could do just about anything. So already we're adding a little bit of flair to the whole thing. If you know the Apostles' Creed, this was something that was put together in the early centuries of the church as a way of saying, this is what it means to be Christian. There's a lot of arguments and discussions and other things that happen, and this is the stuff where they said, okay, there's a lot of diversity of opinions and a lot of arguments we can have on a lot of issues, but when it comes down to it, this is the stuff that they said is essential. The stuff that they argue, and I believe, we'll get into what I mean by that this is what was communicated from the apostles and onward. This is the stuff that is saying something about not just Christianity, but also saying something about the world. Because Christianity isn't this narrow category. What it's saying is, this is the story of what's happening throughout time and space. This is the narrative. This is the universe. We talked about last week how video games have this universe that they're in, and within that universe there are certain rules and goals and patterns and opportunities and all the rest, and contained within that world, learning how to understand the universe means fulfilling what the whole purpose is. And I think so too. We have a universe where there are certain patterns and rules and ideas here. And different religions, they're not trying to make things more difficult. They're really trying to give an explanation. What are the rules for this universe they're in? What does it mean to be a person? What does it mean to live this life? Who are we? Why are we? All the rest. Why are bears? It's all this question. So the Apostles' Creed is this basic set of doctrine, ideas, beliefs that say this is what the world is structured. We are arguing that these things happen, and because these things are in place, all the rest of life starts taking shape in light of this. So what does it say? Let me read it real quick. Feel free to join along wherever you're at. It's always nice to recite a creed if you believe this. I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. I believe in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord. He was conceived by the power of the Holy Spirit and born of the Virgin Mary. He suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. He descended to the dead. On the third day he rose again. He ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father. He will come again to judge the living and the dead. I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Holy Catholic Church, the whole communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and the life everlasting. Amen. So here we have the Apostles' Creed. There's a lot of these things that may be familiar to everyone, and thank you for posting that there. That makes a nice record of this screen. I appreciate it. I failed in providing my usual passages. I don't think this tonight has a lot of verses in it. This is one of my lower verse. We're talking more big picture stuff. But it does have the Apostles' Creed, and there's a few things here that will make sense, a few things that you're definitely familiar with. There might be a couple things, and I think I know what they are, where you're like, what does that mean? Like the Holy Catholic Church, for those of you who are Catholic, if there's anyone out there Catholic, you're saying yes. Right? For those of you who are Protestants, like I am, you're like, well, do I believe in the Holy Catholic Church? We'll get into this. Basically, Catholic is a word that means universal. It's a church that exists everywhere. So notice when I say there's a small c, capitalization is very important. So a lot of these things are clear, but you don't know what does it mean for us. And this isn't just a discussion on theology. This is a discussion on theology and the Christian life. This stuff matters for what we do and how we live and how we try to navigate this world we're in. And this stuff is all important. And my argument, and we'll see how long this takes over the next many weeks, is that every single one of these statements has a distinct impact for who we are, for what we're called to do and how we're called to understand our life and our calling and our purpose. What's the hope we have? And that's what it's all about, really. This hope we have. This hope that this life isn't this small little thing where we're just trying to get by. We're not just salmon trying to get up the river just so we can breed and then die. That's the salmon life. That's not our life, even though we can feel like this sometimes. We're called to this bigger thing, and what we're saying in these statements is there's a bigger reality at work that gives us purpose, gives us meaning, and gives us calling, that we're supposed to live out who we have been created to be in certain ways. And it's not about restricting us, it's not about narrowing us, it's about inviting us into this bigger picture of this world. I think that's fun. This is stuff that can be very frustrating at times in terms of how it's taught. People can make this like, these are the rules and these are the limits, and you sort of have the angry person in charge. And I think of and her name is escaping me. Who's the angry teacher who gets Harry Potter in trouble? A lot of theology people are like that. They're just like, you didn't say it right and you hit the hand, or you write on, and people don't want that. But it was never meant to be like this. The people who put these things together, and these early Christians weren't people who were trying to make things harder. They were trying to say, this is what the world is like. This is what we're invited into. This is what's making this dark and difficult and hard and alienating and frustrating life into saying, there's something here bigger and better that we're called. We're called to sing. We're called to dance. We're called to move in this. And this gives us the framework of that movement. So it's an invitation. And that's really what we're going through, and that's why I'm doing this here. It's not here's all the rules. Dolores Umbridge, yes. Yes, she, that character, we've all met that person, right? The Dolores Umbridge type, who has this sweet little smile and is this nice, and yet is this almost the worst kind of villain, because she just sneaks in and then causes all sorts of chaos and follows all the rules in all the wrong way. And I think that's why a lot of people give up or have a opinion about church or other things, because they've met a lot of Dolores Umbridges in their journey. These people who are just, they can say these words, but they're not getting the life part of it. They're getting the rule keeping, or they're getting the restriction part, but they're not getting the life part. And it's the life part that I think is the big message, because that's what it's about. New life. It's about love. It's about community. All these things. So we're going to talk about, in the first session, I don't know, what do you call this first stream, we're going to talk, and maybe we'll finish tonight, maybe we'll not finish tonight. We'll see. We don't have a plan. I have some things that I'm going to talk about, but sometimes maybe the Bears are going to do something fun, and we'll stop and watch the Bears a little bit. We're going to talk about I believe in God the Father Almighty. More specifically, we'll get to the God the Father Almighty part, but I want to focus on what does it mean to say I believe, because I think that's the sticking point, actually, in a lot of the discussions about theology and about church, about all the rest, is we so quickly jump into the content so we can have the right facts in our head, but we actually don't get a sense of how powerful it means to say that first part, and how that first part was intended to be understood. What does it mean to say, I believe? Right? Some of you are, I want to believe. What is the truth is out there. Right? There's something we want. There's something there's on the edges of our understanding, a little beyond what we think is true, and there are people that don't believe us, but is it true? I want to believe. What does it mean to say, I believe? So here we're going to get into different levels of belief. This is another one of those words where we all think we know what it means. What does it mean? If you had to define believe, what would you say? Well, here, it actually has a lot of different meanings, and it can mean something very shallow to something very deep. And that's the problem, because in a church setting or when you hear people talk, people can come at this with a lot of different meanings to what this is. What does it mean to believe? First, we can have uncertain. I kind of think so, but maybe not. I believe we'll end tonight before 8 p.m. Is that likely? Well, it hasn't been the last few weeks, but of course I've started late, so maybe, right? The goal is to go to 8, so I think we're going to finish around 8. I'm not committed. If we go over, there's no bell that's ringing. People can come and go as they want. I have no idea. So, but I think we're going to end around 8. I believe that. That's exactly how a lot of people come to their religion or other goals in life. I believe I'm going to do this, but don't hold me too much to it. We'll keep our options open. A little more certain, but still open. I have an opinion. I have a strong opinion. Maybe it's not even an informed opinion about it. I can say I believe there are people watching this. I think there's people. People have made comments, but they haven't made comments in a while, so maybe everyone's gone. I don't know. But I believe there are people watching this. I don't think I'm here alone. Am I here alone? I don't think so. I want to believe there are people actually out there. Are you out there? Certain based on a decision. That's another level. I'm convinced, but others might disagree. So this is one of those, I believe in there is a God, to make it more intellectual, or even more simple. I believe that my favorite ice cream is mint. Now I've long said, what's your favorite ice cream? And I always say mint, but I'm like, is it mint? I believe that's true. I would make that my favorite movie. Is the movie Glory, if you ever seen it. Came at this perfect time in life, and it just had this impact when I was really into Civil War stuff, and I loved it. I'm convinced this is true. I'm convinced something is you can go down the list of things I'm convinced of, but other people might have different opinions, and I might be wrong depending on what it is. I might be wrong about the weather this week. I believe it's going to be in the 70s later this week here. But I could be wrong, and if I'm, things might happen. I don't know, but I think that's true. So this is where I would say most people are in terms of their belief about a religion. And yes, I'm not alone. It's always nice to know the beliefs are true. I'm not alone. I can have a big picture. So. I think most people, they'll take a stance on this, they'll commit to it, they'll say this is true, but then they don't want to be too judgmental, because that's the problem about having an opinion, right? We want to have opinions, but we're very careful about stating facts, because if we start stating facts about certain things, that means we're right and other people are wrong, and we're very careful about what categories we choose for that to be applied to. Which is interesting, because everyone has strong opinions about some things where they're like, if the music choice or things where they'll say you're wrong about. They'll have absolute confidence, and people aren't afraid of being wrong about calling other people wrong about some things. But other categories like religion or such, we're willing to say, well, we don't want to be too judgy about it, even though I believe we'll put it in this little category over there. Another one, and getting a little more serious, is very certain. It's a conviction. This is where you say absolutely convinced, you're willing to test it, you're willing to risk it. This is one of those, you could talk about medical care, you can talk about all sorts of choices. If I want to go to Portland, for instance, as I'm apt to do a few times every year, I believe I'm going to get on Interstate 5 and drive there. Maybe there's other options, but that's the way that'll get me there fast. I'm convinced. I'm willing to test it. It seems to have worked for me. Maybe there's those 101ers out there. Ooh, fancy. And then that's a very powerful place. We'll go back and sit with that one a little bit. That's a powerful place to be. But the trouble is, it tends to be very intellectual still. It tends to be, I'm convinced this is true, and I'm willing to trust it, that this is right, but I still put it in this little box off to the side. My going to Portland isn't going to take up all my life and thoughts and orient how I go through everything in my life. I don't know why I use the go to Portlandite model, but it just seems like one of those things that fits. More deeply is I believe in terms of I believe in something. I'm actually putting myself in this belief, willing to stake everything on it. So this is where belief isn't just a matter of opinion or options or choice. It's I'm going to commit myself to the rules and the patterns and the ideas of this, and I'm going all in. We trust, when we say I believe in God the Father then, and I think this is where the creed is arguing. It's not just I believe intellectually or I believe as in a matter of opinion or all the rest. It's I believe as a matter of trusting God. And this is where the posture changes, where instead of saying, I believe, but you can convince me I'm wrong, it's willing to say, I believe this so much that even if I don't understand everything about it, or even when I've lost some of my confidence, I'm going to believe this is true as a way of helping me navigate and keep going. I think this is more true than my current experiences might be about it. Our trust transcends understanding. It's a commitment to this. We're in this, and this is what the creed was intended to say, because the early Christians were willing to die for this. And that's a powerful testimony. They were told, you can sacrifice to the emperor and you're fine, and as long as you say the emperor's Lord, you can have whatever God you want. And the early Christian says, no, we can't do that. There's one Lord. I believe in God the Father Almighty. There's no other God out that is able to step in that role. And the Roman officials would say, are you sure about that? Because if you don't do your sacrifice, we're going to kill you, and kill you horribly, or torture you horribly. And the Romans were very good at that. The Christian said, no, I believe in God the Father Almighty. And all the rest we talked about. I believe this so much that the rules of Rome, the attempts to dissuade us by torture or threat of death, means nothing, because the rules of Rome are effectively, they don't have meaning in this. So, like the sea, I love this. Isn't that a beautiful view? Oh my God, that's a great, look at those mountains. I love they pulled back and we see this big picture. And when you see the big picture, you say, I'm not going to let myself get undermined by small stuff. I'm not going to let myself get distracted. I'm not going to let myself get pulled away and drawn out of this declaration, because what it means to say, I believe in God the Father Almighty, now redefines how I approach everything else. The main thrust, I like this quote. This is from an author named Justo Gonzalez, who wrote on the Apostles' Creed. Next, in coming weeks, I'll highlight some. There's some good books if you want to read more on this. There's some good books out there. And he writes, the main thrust is that we trust God for our lives, and also that is this God that we live in. This God we live and believe, that this God is the foundation and the context of our belief. God isn't this separate subject that's put on the religion shelf. God is all of it. We enter into the universe where God's godness is defining for every part of our life. God is the God of all things. And how many things is that? That's all of them. Everything. So what does it mean to say then, I believe in God? Well, there's been a lot of debates on that. Well, how do we know? How do we know I'm right on this? That's the question, right? How do I know? Isn't it kind of arrogant to say I believe in God? Well, prove it to me. Well, over the course of the centuries, there have been people that have tried to prove this, and to greater or lesser extent, it works. Mostly, again, it's this intellectual thing. The bigger proof for me has been how people live their lives, the testimony of those Christians who are willing to die for it, the arguments about the resurrection go on the list. But being that we like sort of this science-ish kind of idea, having some proofs out there may not get us over the finish line, but it's nice to have some ways of debating it. So here are some classic ways that they've said you can prove God through these things, and most of them have had holes poked in them a little bit. But proof. Here's the cosmological argument. Aristotle had this, so we're not talking this isn't just for Christians. This is for all sorts of people, that a God existed. Something got this all started, right? So we know that everything has a cause, right? We should know that. Everything has a cause, and so everything got started by something else. I started this video, so this video didn't just appear out of the blue and suddenly appear, and everything has a beginning. Well, everything that got started by something else, that got started by something else, that got started by something else, that go back through the ages of the universe. Do you ever get back to the point where something started that wasn't itself started? Aha! Oh, that's a, there we go. Who started the thing from the beginning that wasn't started? Or we don't have an eternal universe, right? Something got everything started, and so that starter of all the things is said to be God. How's that proven God? Well, something got everything started, so that that's a good argument. That's been popular for a while. Another one is what's called the ontological argument. I'm giving you some good vocabulary words. Ontology just means your being, yourself. A proof of God by way of saying God is perfect in all ways. So, what does it mean to be perfect? Right. That is a big question. We all can draw now. Get out a piece of paper and draw something perfect. Seriously, get out a piece of paper, draw something. What would be the perfect thing on that piece of paper, right? What would be your perfect place? What would be your perfect house? What would be your perfect, go down the list, what would it be? Now, you know what would make that perfect thing even more perfect? If it actually existed. Imagine if the thing you drew, and I didn't give you much time. If I had, this is more of a craft show, I'd say, get out your pencil and we'd all draw something. You can watch the video, pause it, draw it later. Actually existing is more perfect than the idea of something. So you can come up with this perfect thing, but if it actually existed, it's more perfect. Now here's the fun part. Now God, being the most perfect of all things, is by definition the most perfect that can perfect. So God, by definition, must exist. Because if God is defined as being the most perfect, then existence is more perfect than non-existence. Thus, God. Well, that one is a good. That convinced some people. It's a good. It's almost more of a word game than an actual proof. The argument that came back fairly early on was that, well, that's good thoughts, but there are things I can imagine that don't actually exist. So I would love to have a house on the coast of Southern California that I pay $150,000 for and has 3 acres of land. That would be and a forest in the background. That would be a perfect house for me. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. Things exist that we can imagine that don't exist. So that's not a great argument. So cross that one off. Blaise Pascal, a French mathematician and theologian and all-around guy who knows everything and is this great thinker and is good at all sorts of stuff, the person. He was a very thoughtful thinker who analyzed the nature of God and the nature of humanity in both the scientific ways and go down the list. He makes a very pragmatic argument here. So his argument isn't necessarily proving God exists per se. Per se, that's one of those intellectual things. Academics say that. And also, as it were. I had a professor who always say, as it were. And I never knew what that means. If you actually, as it were, what does that mean? Sorry. Inner dialogue. I need like a thought bubble things. Can you have like thought bubbles go on? I'll have to work into that. Pascal argued that maybe God exists, maybe God doesn't exist. But it's a better bet to say God does exist and to live as if God does exist. Because if God doesn't exist, then you've wasted nothing. Life is meaningless. Go down the list. You haven't lost anything. But if God exists and you don't believe in God, you're in trouble. So there's nothing to lose here by believing in God, because it's win if he does, no loss if he doesn't. So go ahead and believe. Now, while that is actually a decent argument, I think, and I will be honest here, that did get me through some rough seasons of life early on in my 20s, where I'm like, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can do this church thing or this. I believe some of the basics here, but I don't know what to do with all the mess that's been happening and I've been seeing. This one actually said, I really did say to myself, I'll just keep going because it's a better bet. And that's a good maybe foundation or baseline. It's very hard to get excited about believing or excited about life. Hey, let's live life. We got nothing to lose. That's a hard message to share. That's a hard message to give into your imagination. And so while it may be helpful, it's not great. I like this one, history. This is what I would argue the Bible does. How does the Bible prove God? Have you ever asked that question? Well, I just did. So repeat after me. How does the Bible prove God? Now you've asked that question. The Bible proves God not by going through intellectual debates or having these arguments or these Twitter back and forths or these aha moments. The Bible, I would argue, and there's some debate on this, but I'm the one talking, so I'm going to go ahead and say assertively, the Bible argues God's existence based on history. The idea stuff happens. Now, where does that come from? Well, we have the Genesis passage where it says God created. Now, that is a little bit looser because that's one of those things where people have a lot of different arguments about whether God created or how God created. So we jump ahead a little bit to the Exodus narrative. And this is where I would argue the Bible becomes very, very pointed about how God is asserting God's almightiness. God the Father Almighty is what we're saying. Well, what do we read about in the Exodus narrative? And in the Exodus narrative, you have Israel who's enslaved. They're praying for hundreds and hundreds of years for salvation. And then Moses comes along, messes things up at first, goes off and runs away, having failed in his attempt to liberate through the means of the world. And God says, hey, you, and he says that through a burning bush, hey, you, I want you to bring my people out. And Moses says, why should I do that? Do you know who you're talking to? And God says, I'm going to do it. And then he does it. So that's the argument. This is the argument of whether we can trust God. Does God do the things that God says he's going to do? And God is willing to put his own self at risk. What if the Israelites hadn't been freed? And God wouldn't have fulfilled his promise, and you look elsewhere. Now we jump ahead to that and we say, in Christian terms, is Jesus God? Can we trust the Christian message? Well, the argument here, we say, is that Jesus died and rose again. So we're not saying something mystical or something philosophical. We're saying this guy was dead and this guy is now alive. And if you think that stretching things, Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 argues if that wasn't true, we're all wasting our time. Go watch something else. The rest of this is bunk. But the argument is God proves himself by doing the things God says he'll do. It happens. And if it happens, you can trust that he's going to do the next thing. So we can also talk about God in general terms. What does it mean to have a God? See, we're getting big picture here. This is all meta stuff. This is all, setting the stage for the discussions about what does it mean to have a God. What we can call classical theism is one of the ways they've talked about it. Greek terms, I talked about Aristotle. Well, they like talking about what does it mean to be a God. They like to really get those definitions so you know what to look for, what to spot. A God, and we're not talking just about the Christian God here. We're talking about a God. General terms, is omniscient. Do you know what omniscient means? Here's your vocabulary list. This will be on the test for next week, so study, write these down. It's not a test because I can't grade anything. I don't want to. A God is omniscient. A God knows all things, everything there is to know. A God knows those things. A God is omnipresent. God is not limited to space or time. It's not limited to a certain place or a certain moment. God is everywhere, fills all the things. A God is omnipotent. A God almighty, powerful. If God gets what he wants, she wants. A God is impassive. Here's the trickier one for us. A God isn't going to be affected by things around. It's not, we're like all of us are affected by what goes on. If you're driving down the street and minding your own business, and all of a sudden a car cuts you off and then drives 20 miles under the speed limit, it takes a very saintly person among us not to be affected by that. We're affected by, we're bombarded and affected, and our moods change, and our goals change. We who knows what we're going to do based upon our moods? And what this is saying is a God isn't affected by all that. A God does what a God wants to do and isn't affected by the stuff going around. Infinite. How much of God is there? All. There's never no end. God, we can say, lives without a time limit. I'm going to see if this works. We'll see. Because this is my argument. That while those are the attributes of a God, I think that the Bible talks about God in a different way than that. And that when we start with the attributes of a God, then we try to fit everything we talk about in religious terms, but that isn't actually in keeping with what we say God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is doing. We'll see if we get some sound on this. This may be trying a little too much. Can you hear that? Anyone hear that? Is there any noise at all going on here? You all know where this is from. This is from the Prince of Egypt. So if this isn't working, I'm trying to expand my technology, but maybe I'm just interfering. Not yet. All right. We won't fiddle around with video, with the audio. We'll see. There's always things to learn. There's always more things to learn. So somewhere there's a setting to turn this volume up, but I don't know what it is. Let's see. It should be that one, but it's not working, so I don't know. Basically, the story is, and I encourage you to watch this scene if you can find it on YouTube. I'll work this out later on. When we are introduced to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the story of Moses, we see God interacting in a very different way than those very philosophical categories of omniscience and omnipotence, and all the rest. We see God passionate. We see God involved. We see God calling, but then God gets angry, and God is active, and in this story of Moses calling, this we see the emotions and purpose and will and all the rest. And if we define God in foreign ways, we miss the genuineness, the personality that I think is very helpful for what we're doing here. We know that when Moses asks, "Who is God?" he says, "I am." God is. God exists. And so in this story, and I encourage you to read this is the first few chapters of Exodus. Read this stuff. This is good. God is involved. God isn't this separate, has all the traits and power, but is sort of in this passive potentiality. Ooh, that's a good word. God is involved. We know in the Bible that God is in the mix. God is participating. God is mighty. God doesn't just have all this potential power. God uses this power in a very specific way. God is committed. That is maybe the brilliant narrative of this stuff, that God is committed to his purpose. He says, "I'm going to do this," and he sees it through. God's will is trustworthy. God is passionate. Now, there's a lot of attempts in theology and other ways to sort of take this emotion side out, saying that's just added. But you can't avoid the fact that all through the Old Testament, God has these emotions and passions. He doesn't just say, "I have this plan," and then as a removed judge or this boss or this bureaucrat just rubber stamp this thing. No, God is passionate about what he is for, and passionate about when things go wrong, and God gets excited about people, and God gets angry at people, but not because people have broken this foreign laws, because the language used in the Old Testament is jealousy. God loves, and people are betraying him, and he gets mad about that, and he wants to fix it, and everything is wrong, and God says, "I'm going to put it right, and here's the guy I'm going to choose to do it because I'm committed to this." And this isn't a story that's going to end. God is in this. So the idea of eternal is a little bit different than infinite. Infinite sort of has this numerical quality. Eternal has this presence. We're wrapped in God's presence. We're invited into God's presence, and this isn't something that's going to have a contract that comes to an end and we're going to be on our own. This is as far as the eye can see, as long as we can imagine and beyond. God is faithful. God is true. This is why God often takes longer than we might want, because God's not in this for a short story. This is a narrative that continues. I liked C.S. Lewis's The Last Battle is further in and farther up. It's like never ending. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger the more you explore. And even theology is like this. The more you study theology, and I've done this a long time, you think, okay, I'm going to have the answers to the questions and be able to move on. The more you realize the world gets bigger and bigger and more complex. And this isn't just true in theology. This is true in science, right? Okay, we're going to get a microscope out and we're going to see the small things. And then they saw the small things and realized those things are made of smaller things and small. It's like this, as far in this bigness and far as the smallness, there's this more and more to discover. And that's an invitation. Being eternal isn't this weight we have. There's this invitation into this kind of life where God is involved, God's mighty, God's committed, God's passionate. And we can trust God because of this. And Moses trusted God, and the people trusted God. And the story of the Bible is the people who live in light of this trust, see God's work in full. And then there's people who get distracted, or things aren't working and they lose their belief. And they fall off to the side or don't continue. And God says, just keep going. And what this whole story is we're talking about is this idea that we're called to keep going. When things are rough, keep going. When we don't know where to go next, just keep going, because God is faithful. That's the narrative. I believe in God's faithfulness more than I believe in my temporary or momentary perceptions. Do I believe that God is working? Yes. Now that affects how I live my life today. And that's why we keep studying this stuff. Why keep asking questions? What is this? Now that I say I believe in God and here's the Bible, well, why keep asking questions? Hasn't it all solved? Well, yes and no. There's a lot of things we've been told, but I'm living this life for the first time. I've never lived this life before. I've never experienced the things I'm experiencing in a lot of ways. There's the similarities, and I'm at 44, I'm better at it than I used to, but there's still these things that are kind of similar to things I've done before, but they trip me up because they're new in different ways. And so I keep having these questions. I keep encountering people with different stories and different narratives and different ideas than I have. That's why theology is this continuing task. It's this invitation. And this is where I really disagree with how a lot of theology is taught, and how a lot of even churches try to teach things where they say, here's the questions you're supposed to ask, and here's the answer to these questions. Now memorize that, and you're good. A lot of churches have this approach to saying, here's this, and this is maybe a good beginning task, but the trouble is then it limits us to thinking those are the only questions we can ask, or it makes us afraid. It's one of those things I've learned in teaching theology is one of the first things I have to do to get a class involved is simply help them understand that they can ask questions without being afraid that if they get it wrong, they're going to be kicked out. We're so afraid of asking questions because in so many churches there's no space for that. So people don't want to dare give the wrong answer because they think if they give the wrong answer, then everyone's going to judge them. And that is completely counter to what we see in the Gospels, where Jesus invited these conversations, and oftentimes they were really stupid questions, and Jesus responded to them anyhow. We're calling people to invite them into discovering, because theology has some general rules and guidelines and ideas, but we're all navigating these questions ourselves. And if we aren't able to ask the questions, then we're not being pulled into this kind of relationship where God is able to say, here's who I am. Here's some response. We're not called into conversation, and I think theology is conversation. I have a lot of knowledge about how theology is taught in decades past or centuries past. I showed theology books. I've read a lot of those, but those don't encompass the whole part of who God is. Every person's life is encountering God in a distinct way. Every person's life has questions or issues that are slightly different. And if we don't give people the space to talk about it, then what we're saying is God isn't infinite or eternal at all. God is very narrow. We're actually saying God is restricted to these certain boundaries. And that's counter to what we say Christian theology is. Last time we talked about how Christian theology is coherent. Has to be coherent. And what coherence means is if we say God is infinite and eternal, that means God reaches out across our boundaries. And that means sometimes God reaches out across the boundaries of things that have been discussed. Just because there are some really, really smart people who lived in the 5th century who used very big words and complicated phrases and put together volumes of really good stuff doesn't mean they said it all. Just because someone can have a lot of degrees and have studied the stuff faithfully for a number of years, it's not meaningless. It's helpful, but it's not everything. Because God is infinite. So God's work in this world is beyond my own experience of it. So God's work in this world is beyond your experience. So we learn and we listen, we ask questions. There are things that are happening in today's world that haven't been happening before. Now, that sounds kind of arrogant, but one big thing that has changed over the last 50, 60 years, maybe 70 years now, is the idea that for the first time in human history, we can actually destroy the whole world. Well, that's a theological problem that they didn't have to necessarily wrestle with in the 5th century. We have the capacity to destroy the world. And we're maybe doing it slowly, maybe we're not doing it slowly. We have this capacity, so how do we navigate that power? How do we navigate living this life? How do we navigate the fear that it could happen? That's a trick. So we're trying to search for something that's incomprehensible. So that seems like something that says, well, why even ask? But just because it's incomprehensible doesn't mean we can understand. We have to. Nothing is understandable. Let me say that again, because when I even confuse myself and don't know what I mean by a sentence, that's always a bad sign. We're searching for the incomprehensible, something that's bigger and beyond us, but that doesn't mean we can't learn anything. We can learn some things. We can begin to understand. Even if we don't get the full picture, we can start getting a glimpse. We don't see the full scene of all the bears. There's a bigger world there, but we can see this, and what we're seeing is amazing. The heart is insatiable. We want to know. Humans are curious. And when you resist or restrict that curiosity, people become passive. They become uninvolved. And the best way to keep people uninterested in spirituality, uninterested in Christianity, uninterested in any of the rest of the stuff we're talking about is to say that, here's all the facts and this is all you want to know and your questions don't matter. No, we want to know. And in that curiosity, I think, is a work of God inviting us into this deeper reality. C.S. Lewis called this yearning, this sense of this joy, this yearning for something bigger and deeper, and he tasted of that, and that pushed him farther and farther because he realized there was something beyond his own experiences that was saying yes to life. And exactly the way science explores the world. I think this is where theology and science really can share a lot of things. There's no end to what we can know about the world because the world is so much more complex than we know what to do with, and yet we can know parts. And certain people know very specific things about very narrow things, and they start talking to each other, and you can say, well, here's this thing here, here's that thing there. And in the conversation, in the driving curiosity, we actually can learn how to live life, hopefully better. But even in the journey of it, there's something fun about learning. Here's the other thing, and this is I think, the one that's often left out of these discussions. How we understand God is not reflective of who God is and God's own nature out there. We're human. And I assume that everyone who's out there is also human. I could be wrong, but, and being human, we have our categories, we have our biases, we have our experiences. I was born in Southern California. No, I was born in Illinois. I keep saying I was born in Southern California. I come from 6 generations of Southern Californians, so I like to say I'm Californian, but confession here, I was born in Illinois. My parents were out going to school, so am I a fraud? No. But I see the world shaped by multi-generations of Californians which have a very distinct approach to life. An American citizen, I'm born in the 1970s, which changes how I view the world versus how my daughter views the world. All these things affect how I understand and talk about God. And so, same thing with theology. How we talk about God is shaped by our cultural situation. How we talk about God is shaped by our time and place. The questions that theology has answered were very living questions at the time they were asked. So even Scripture does this. And I know I'm getting a little tricky ground, but even Scripture was written for a certain time and place. And so the question Scripture is asking is based on the kinds of questions. Yes, we are distinct, right? We're our own people. It's based on the things that they were wrestling. Most of us aren't wrestling now with whether Gentiles are allowed to be part of the church. But if you read the New Testament, that was a very pressing decision based on the Jewish culture at the time and the world they were living in. And while that has some relevance, that's shaping how they talk about God. So a theology of the New Testament is shaped around certain questions. It invites us into bigger questions and is a resource for us. But because every culture and every era and every time has a narrow conception about what it means to live life, so too our conception about God is narrow in the same way. We can't live outside of our own perception. Where everything is based on our observation, our experience of life. So many things, in fact, we think are just, this is what it means to be human, but because this is only our experience of human, we don't know that that's actually not, that people have very different experiences. And in our day and age, we're being exposed to a lot more of the world, but even still, I don't know what it is like to live in a different part of the world I don't know what it's like to be born in a different part of the world. I don't like. There's a lot of things. People who are great travelers and know that there's just a different way of understanding and seeing. There's different underlying rules and patterns and habits, and that shapes. So God is mediated. And again, this isn't a reflection of who God is. It's a reflection of our ability to talk about God, and that's a key distinction. How we talk about God is affected by our voice. And if we say the only way to talk about God is how they talked about God in the 12th century Europe, then we're saying God is limited only to that time and culture, and our perception of God then is shaped if we were really, good 12th century medieval Europeans. Most of us, and I will go ahead and say I believe that none of us are 12th century medieval Europeans. I could be wrong. Some of us are a little closer to that than others, but we're all living now. And again, that's a big risk, but I'm going to say I believe that we're all living now in this day and age. See if, who knows how long this video will last. I like what Elizabeth Johnson says. She has this great introduction to Christianity called Quest for the Living God. She's a Catholic theologian, but this is great invitation. The profound incomprehensibility of God coupled with the hunger of the human heart in changing historical cultures actually requires that there be an ongoing history of the quest for the living God that can never be concluded. We're invited into continuing to ask questions, continuing to explore, continuing even to hone our language. Sometimes language, the very terms and words we use that can have been helpful for some eras based on concerns they had, aren't as helpful for us now. And so we need to say, how effective are these words? How helpful are these words? Should we change how we talk about certain things? Now, it's not to say yes or no. It's to say we're invited into this continued journey because theology is about communicating, sharing, understanding God in our own lives and in the lives of those around us. All right. I tempted you, see, right? Now here we have Thor. But I think this is jumping into whole nother topic and a whole nother theme of how we believe what we believe. And so I'm going to end it there. Yes, good. Still alive. Yes. And maybe cover this next week, or we might jump ahead. This week is all this belief stuff is talking about some behind the scenes issue. It's not as interesting or directly relevant, but it does shape how we understand things and why we're talking about theology in a different way than they used to before, because the questions they asked in decades and centuries past is different than the questions we're asking now. And oftentimes we are not aware of that. We don't get a sense that we're trying to take old answers to questions we never asked and say this is what Christianity is. Here's an answer to a question you've never asked. That's not a great way of helping people discover the living God and the relationship with him, but that's often how a lot of evangelism. Here's a list of questions I'm telling you to ask, and here's the answers I prepared that will fit those questions. And people say, it has nothing to do with me. And they're not wrong. That's the funny thing. They're not wrong, because people are trying to discover what life means for them. People are seeking this hope and this fullness, and if we're offering a very narrow vision of who God is and how to talk about God, and then judge them for not accepting that very narrow vision, what does that say about us? Essentially, that's saying we don't even believe the things we say we believe. We don't believe that God is present and active and inviting people in light of where they're at now. We don't believe that the Gospels, where Jesus goes and meets people in all sorts of different settings and affects how he talks to them in his message. We want to have this very narrow range of places we're comfortable with and say that's Christianity. It's not it at all. Now, it doesn't mean that stuff's wrong at certain contexts or places. There's always people who respond to that stuff. But if that's our whole vision of what it means to be a Christian and to invite people in, that's just not it. And so as we continue next week and onward, we're going to talk a little bit more about what it is that Christianity is inviting us into. What is theology doing? How can we understand the Apostles' Creed not as a narrowed vision, but as an invitation into this universe, so that we're all characters walking our journey in different and unique ways, but we're operating in light of the God who's present with us and inviting us and empowering us and saying, I want you to live in the way I've called you to live. That's the invitation. And that means inviting our own questions and challenges and concerns and letting theology be nimble enough to respond to that. Because if theology is very constrained, then that's a good argument against it. Because if God is the God of all things, then God is able to be addressed in an unlimited amount of questions, unlimited amount of context, translatable to different situations and eras and times and cultures. And that's what we're saying when we say, I believe in God the Father Almighty. God is the Father of all of us. God is present and will keep going on in this journey. I've tempted you with Thor and Odin there. My favorite pantheon, not surprisingly. So again, if you have questions or thoughts or ideas, feel free to ask them in the chat. Feel free to email them. patrickoden@gmail is my email. I'm happy to play with however we want to walk through this. But thank you again for joining me this evening. I'm excited still. It's a good sign about what this is. I'm excited about talking through this stuff. If you can't tell, I like talking about this stuff. This is part of my own journey of trying to wrestle with things that were too difficult to understand. And I started seeing this light and this ideas, and they get me excited. And the challenge is, I said to myself, after college, that rather than going to law school, which made a lot of practical sense, what would I do if money wasn't an object? I said, I wanted to study the Bible. I wanted to study theology, because that was the way I was seeing this path of hope. And I've discovered that hope. Now we're trying to work out the pay side. Things get tricky when you have a profession. But I believe that God's called me into this. I believe that God's called you into this. So I'm excited to see where this journey continues. All right. I will talk to you all when we talk next. May God be with you at every step.